Now on Radio 4, Howard Stableford investigates whether 3D printing has developed in a way that can benefit wildlife in 3D bioprinting.
Hello.
Joe,
Hey.
you must be Joe.
Yeah, you're Howard.
Yeah, hi, how are you?
Nice to meet you.
Nice to
Joe
see you.
Weisenbach.
The first living organ created with the use of a 3D bioprinter
3D printing
will be
has
released.
started a revolution. The revolution brewing in electronics is unprecedented.
Dudley the duckling
even for an
takes his
industry
first
that-
steps on a 3D printed leg. After losing his own,
3D printing is reasonably old technology, if you bear in mind that things like Facebook are only about 10 years old. 3D printing was developed in the 1980s, and it was originally called rapid prototyping.
I've seen some articles there where people were a little bit confused and thinking we were actually printing coral, and it's not about printing coral. It's about printing a very natural-looking substrate that coral certainly can settle on.
Go online, pick up any newspaper, switch on a television. It's hard to escape the explosion of 3D printing stories in the media. Every day, it seems, the latest developments in 3D printing are thrust in front of our eyes and ears. And although the process of recreating inanimate objects through a relatively simple layering printed process isn't new, today we find ourselves standing at a watershed. 3D printing is at the cusp of an electronic and technological revolution, the likes of which the world hasn't seen since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution over 200 years ago. The indications are that it could soon be possible for 3D printers to manufacture any object from any material, including living cells. For this programme, I want to look at a specific aspect of 3D printing to examine what its potential might be for conserving the natural world. Could 3D printing be used to benefit wildlife in the near future, and longer term, could we even bring back an extinct species? I'd come across one form of 3D printing called stereolithography many years ago while presenting Tomorrow's World. However, I had never seen a 3D printer in its modern accessible form, and I was surprised to find there's a 3D printing shop close to me in Colorado. I went to see Joe Weisenbach, who runs it. Joe, this is the first time I've actually seen a 3D printer in the flesh, as it were, and you've got 3 different types of machines, or at least different sizes. First of all, I'm surprised how small they are. The biggest is only, about a metre high, a metre deep. It's a cube. It's very good looking. It's sort of in perspex, so you can see exactly what's happening all the time. What's this big one doing with its lovely blue fluorescent lights and everything?
Right now we're starting the perch for the bird feeder.
You heard right. A cutting-edge bird feeder. Researching this programme, I'd come across a 3D model and design site called Printed Nest, offering a free download for quite a snazzy-looking 3D printed bird feeder. I asked Joe if he could make it for me. First, he explained the process.
The way that these things work is it melts the plastic. In this case it's an ABS plastic, styrene, and it forces the plastic through a small nozzle and deposits it on a heated bed. And the bed is heated so that the material will stick to the bed. So right now it's just laying down a pattern on the bed to prepare for the print. If you can imagine a three-dimensional object, if you were to slice it into lots of horizontal slices, that's what the software does to prepare the machine for the printing. On this particular model, there's about 500 slices for this object, just to make the perch.
Bird feeder perch is
Yeah.
500 slices?
Yes.
I see.
You can make the slices whatever thickness you want, but it improves the quality if you make the slices thinner.
Ah. Well, we're going to be making this bird feeder, and I sent you the link to that website. Then what did you do from there?
This website has tens of thousands of drawings. So I downloaded it from the web, I loaded it in to our software and into a program called a slicer, and it slices it up and converts it into what they call G-code, which is what is then sent to the printer as the commands.
And it's quite interesting, this bird feeder, because of the lattice work, right? It's not a solid object. Does that make it more complicated? Does the printer care?
Doesn't care about the complexity. Oftentimes it takes longer to do these prints than people imagine. In this case, it's going to take about 5 hours to make this bird feeder.
5 hours?
Yeah.
I had a few hours to wait, and this got me thinking. Printing a bird feeder, whilst helpful, wasn't quite going to solve the much broader issues facing the natural world. Further digging on the internet quickly led me to a couple of interesting leads. In America, having been shot by a poacher, a bald eagle had her damaged beak repaired using 3D printing way back in 2005. And more recently, in 2014, Dudley the duck lost his leg during a fight with a chicken. He was fitted with a new 3D prosthetic leg to get around the wildlife rescue centre where he lives. Then, my research led me to a team developing 3D printed living seawalls.
So the living seawall is about creating a wall with 3D printing that can be slotted into your normal construction process, economically, efficiently, without taking extra time. But it just provides basically more nooks and crannies for marine life to use it. And that helps, for example, in some areas you need to bring back biodiversity because a lot of development has decreased biodiversity in the area. Well, this is one way to build with nature, so you're actually helping bring back more biodiversity to the area.
David Lennon is an Australian marine environmental impact specialist who for over 20 years has been looking into the interactions between artificial structures and marine life.
So I call it better design below the waterline. So we're taking the premise that we're going to put structure, we're going to build a seawall which creates structure below the waterline, but instead of making it just smooth and meeting engineering specs, we can actually think about the marine life in the area and how it might use it. So it's about incorporating features within that seawall that make it attractive. Then there might be grooves, it might be small holes, might be small overhangs that just make it more attractive for the marine life in the area, because nature doesn't leave anything alone, and if there's an opportunity there, it'll use it.
Now, why are they better then than ordinary seawalls? I mean, erosion takes effect, those nooks, those crannies get created anyway, naturally, don't they, with normal seawalls?
Well, not really. It depends on the seawall. The seawalls are just designed to withstand a certain amount of current and storm, so you don't get a lot of nooks and crannies, and when you do, they're not necessarily designed for the local species.
It was during our conversation that David mentioned he was involved with the development of 3D printed reef structures off the coast of the Arabian Gulf. I asked him where these reef structures are positioned and what they look like.
Well, at the moment, the ones that are in the water off Bahrain, in the Arabian Gulf. And we do have some units sitting here in Australia waiting permits to go in, but the material is basically sandstone. And that's one of the things we love about this process, is because it looks very, very natural right from the start. And the ones that we design for the Arabian Gulf are very organic looking, and that is one of the key advantages of the 3D printing, is you can make some very, very organic shapes that you can't do with rigid molding techniques like we use now with concrete.
So how did you decide on the shape for the 3D printed structures?
You look at your target species that you want to attract, and that might be fish, it might be coral, it might be abalone, it might be seaweeds. So you look at them and you look at the needs that they have, and it is very much like designing a city and designing a building. You need to understand the size of the doorways they want, the size of the openings, the size of the gaps, because it's all about creating protective space that they'll then use to avoid being eaten, or food that will grow on that they will then eat. So with the 3D units, you're looking at transport as well, so we needed them to fit on a pallet, so 1 metre by 1 metre was a good size and a good weight, and then it was about designing various openings and protruding pieces that would cater to the local snapper, where they like to hide and hang out and, seek refuge.
Now, why was it necessary to do this in the coast off Bahrain?
Well, that particular project was part of a 2-year project to restore fisheries. So what's happened in general, not just in the Arabian Gulf, but around the world, we've lost a lot of natural reef habitat. And then in the Arabian Gulf, they've dredged, they've reclaimed a lot of land, as you know, they've built islands and taken away a lot of natural nearshore reef. Combine that with their lack of fisheries control, they've got plummeting fish stocks. So off Bahrain, the aim was to restore some productive fish habitat, and we built 10 reefs. Now, the majority of the units were all concrete units, but it gave us an opportunity to trial the 3D printed units from Italy. What's enjoyable about reefs is the fish show up straight away. In fact, they're there within seconds of putting down a new habitat, because they're always looking for somewhere to hide. And that's one of the biggest thrills, is when you put these reef units in and watching the fish. And people laugh, but you can almost see the excitement on their face when they're checking out a new habitat and thinking about, I'm going to call this part home. This is my patch.
David Lennon there, ending with what I'm beginning to understand is maybe the importance of conventional 3D printing to certain marine species, that of building solid, personalised structures which can provide target species a home, a shelter, and maybe somewhere to feed. Well, 5 hours and 18 minutes later, I'm back at the 3D printing shop to look at the final result, and I have to say it's rather fantastic, isn't it?
Yeah, I may have surprised you a bit, but we changed the colors up, so turns out that it's blue, pink, and green.
Blue, pink, and leafy green.
The birds love it.
They will love it. And the perch, which also took over an hour to print on the different machine, is bright blue as well. Well, great. Thank you so much. I'm going to take this, I'm going to install it in my back garden, and I'm going to sit and wait.
Great.
By the way, we'll put images of my 3D printed feeder and a time-lapse sequence of the process on the Radio 4 website. So far, in my investigation, I have only come across physical structures that can help wildlife. It seems sensible, though, to think that as 3D printing advances, new materials to print with will open up worlds of new possibilities. Earlier this year, the term bioprinting was officially included into the Oxford dictionaries. I looked it up. The use of 3D printed technology with materials that incorporate viable living cells. Delving deeper into the research reveals an increasing use of 3D bioprinting, especially within medicine. Skin, tissues, even organs are, according to reports, being routinely printed to assist human patients. Well, this seems light years ahead of printing a plastic bird feeder. Is it the same process? And what exactly is meant by printing living cells?
In reality, what's happening is 3D printing is part of the process which we're reading about, but 3D printing isn't actually printing the tissue directly.
Answering some of my questions is Brian Darby, Professor of Materials Science at the University of Manchester, where the School of Materials looks at 3D printing in both biology and medicine.
A tissue is a very, very complicated thing. We can't really reproduce or make tissue from scratch by 3D printing or any other means at the moment. What we can do is we can use a process which is called tissue engineering. And in tissue engineering, we persuade biological processes, natural biological processes, to work with natural things such as cells and persuade them, the cells that is, to build the tissue. And where 3D bioprinting comes in is that we can use 3D bioprinting to build what's called a scaffold. We build a structure, which is usually a temporary structure, which will dissolve away over time. And while it's there, the cells use that as a series of cues and as a scaffold that instructs them what the structure is going to look like.
We're all getting more familiar with 3D printing in conventional materials. And the great opportunity for those of us with an orientation towards medicine is its opportunity for personalisation.
David Williams is Professor of Healthcare Engineering at Loughborough University and involved with the practical applications of 3D printed tissues, specifically in medicine.
So what I mean by personalization is the ability to make a shape that is tailored to you specifically. We're used to it with conventional materials, but we're now, a large number of people in the community are beginning to add live cells to conventional materials in order to try and make living materials, in particular living scaffolds, where we're combining the cells with the environment in which they grow to make a tissue. A tissue is a cell plus other things. Therefore, if we 3D print things, we can make cells that might become a tissue by incorporating them in a scaffold. And the trick with 3D printing is it allows us to create lots of different geometries and different complexities. That's both external to the shape of the object and inside it.
When people talk about 3D bioprinting in the press, they often mix this with printing cells. Now, the scaffolds I talked about earlier, which would be used in tissue engineering, we have to get cells inside them. And at the moment, that's done by preparing the cells in suspension. So they're a bit like a thick soup or a porridge. And we have to infiltrate this soup-like structure where the cells are in suspension into the scaffold. So I should emphasize, we're not printing the tissue. We're trying to produce structures which more closely mimic the tissue, which we're persuading the cells to build themselves.
When we think about 3D printing a tissue that's made of a scaffold and cells, there are some bits of it that are, let's say, conventional materials, but there are other bits of it that are alive. When we print them, we have to keep them alive as we print them, and then we have to keep them alive when they've been printed, after they've been printed. So, for example, they have to be fed, like we have to be fed. They have to be provided with nutrients. We have to take their waste products away. So keeping these constructs alive after we've printed them is a very subtle and a process we have to crack.
OK, so what I've learned so far is 3D bioprinting is very complex, challenging, certainly fascinating, but are we near the point when we could reproduce a living species? An Orwellian thought may be, but as DNA techniques advance alongside 3D printing, is it unreasonable to think that 3D printing might one day bring the iconic dodo back from the dead? Brian Darby.
We would need to have the raw materials which is compatible with the final object, the final extinct animal. And in biology, the key thing there is the DNA. One can synthesize DNA, although the genome of an organism consists of many, many thousands and thousands of components. And that would have to be built using different technologies from 3D printing, because 3D printing works on something about the size of a cell upwards. And if you're making any complicated object, whether it's a car to an aeroplane, some domestic item, we work from a design. So let us say we have the technology to build any organism. And we go along to Organisms Are Us, and we say, well, we've got this idea. We'd like you to build us a dodo. Can you build them for us? And the guy says, fine, great, we'll do it. Have you got the design file? We'd like to have it in this format. And you'd have to go to them and say, well, actually, no, we don't have the design file. What we have are some rather neat paintings and photographs of cadavers of dodos and sketches from ship's logs in the 18th century. Can we use those to make a dodo? Of course, the answer is no. So we would need a way of explaining to somebody who is going to print a dodo the precise detail internally of a dodo at a very, very high level of resolution. From a very, very fundamental point of view, if you knew exactly how a dodo was built, if you knew its entire internal structure, where the blood vessels were, where the organs were, where the bones were, the beak, the feathers, and you had the full set of instructions how to make each of those, in principle, you could 3D print a dodo. But I would argue that what's much more sensible is to think where the dodo came from. So, to paraphrase the well-known proverb, what came first, the dodo or the egg?
What an intriguing idea. We know birds hatch out of eggs and then develop into adult birds. I wonder if the same thing would happen to a bioprinted hatchling dodo.
It's a much easier prospect to 3D print an egg, because after all, within the egg, there is just initially a single cell, a single fertilized cell. So the biological problem of making millions, probably billions of different cells, which would be used within a 3D printer, and the record-keeping problem of knowing where all those cells ought to be, would be much simpler if all we have is the one cell, which is the initial cell, which contains all the instructions of how to build a dodo, and then just confined our problem to the construction of the egg, which is the food supply, the protection, and, in my opinion, although still an incredibly complicated object, orders of magnitude simpler than building the whole living dodo. So the egg hatches, and out comes a chick. I would imagine that there is a certain amount of stuff which is hardwired into a dodo. And the fact that we have bred animals in captivity without the presence of parents, and these have been released into the wild, or maybe after subsequent generations have been released into the wild, I would think there's nothing inherently absent if we can make these objects from scratch. But of course we've not done that. We've not even really recreated even the simplest bacteria from scratch.
Now I've got the perfect place to install this bird feeder. Out in the back garden, just in this corner, there's a railing and a post, so I'm going to stick it to this post. And the good thing is, it's right by a couple of other bird feeders here, so that should attract the birds pretty quickly. There you go. Right, all I have to do now is sit back and watch. I admit, so far my quest to see if 3D printing can help the natural world has been mixed. The reef ball in the Arabian Gulf is a real step forward, and my colourful bird feeder brings me enormous pleasure. I wonder, though, if the potential for this technology has caught ecologists and biologists napping. Perhaps they're not looking in the right direction. Well, the Environment and Sustainability Institute at the University of Exeter recently installed a 3D printing facility, and Amber Griffiths, who runs the Conservation Genetics Lab, told me why.
We set this up really to expose the people working in the Institute to this new technology. Most of the use of 3D printing within our department has been to make bespoke lab or field equipment, or to rapidly prototype new field equipment. There is a research group using unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs or drones, to do environmental monitoring. When they get a UAV, it's not necessarily ready to attach a camera or a sensor to. 3D printing allows them to do this. And they build custom-made attachments for these vehicles to hold different cameras and sensors that allow them to monitor landscapes or temperature over landscapes or anything else really. By flying a camera over a landscape, they're then able to get extremely high detail on that environment, right down, for example, to individual primrose flowers that they can count using this UAV.
Maybe this is the way forward then. Professor Tim Birkhead from Sheffield University might agree. His long-term research into seabird ecology has recently been given a boost by 3D printed guillemot eggs. Much more versatile than standard ceramic or plastic eggs, these 3D printed eggs can be made in a range of sizes and shapes, and with a screw top designed to contain research data loggers. It seems then that despite all the media reports that 3D printing can manufacture anything anywhere, in 2015 we are still very much on the starting blocks. But in the short term, 3D printing can benefit wildlife by speeding up research and making equipment more affordable and readily available to people. So what's next? Amber Griffiths again.
Within ecology and conservation, the future for 3D printing really is completely wide open. Really, people are only just starting to explore the technology and start to figure out what they can do with it. The thing that I find most interesting about 3D printing is its disruptive potential. The ability to decentralize manufacturing, so you can build what you want at home, you can recycle the materials and build something else. So it's looking at the bigger picture, using less resources, speeding up research.
There's a lot of exciting opportunities, and I think one of the top ones will be for dredging. I think in the future, for example, a dredging company can be operating in an area and pulling sand out of one area, running that sand through a 3D printer, and basically pumping out reef units at the other end. So you've got unavoidable damage that's going to be happening because of the dredging in one area, but then you're offsetting that impact simultaneously by constructing these wonderful sand reef units and carefully placing them in an organized way in another area to offset the dredging. 3D printing now is a fantastic tool to make stuff that just looks more organic, more natural, and can have features that we can't achieve with the with rigid molding.
Could 3D printing be used to bring an extinct species back to life? I think the straightforward answer to that is, on its own, no. 3D printing could be used to make a facsimile which looked like an extinct species. However, producing complete creatures from scratch within the lifetime of most listeners is, in my opinion, quite unlikely.
So sadly, it turns out we're a long way off yet from seeing the dodo return to the Madagascar forests through 3D bioprinting. But all the scientists I spoke to agree that the future of 3D printing, by generating ways to benefit the natural world through new conservation techniques or creating innovative habitats, is very bright indeed. All we can do is wait to see how the future unfolds. And as I wait, I have the colourful consolation of watching my 3D printed bird feeder do its bit for the local bird population. No takers yet.
3D bioprinting was presented by Howard Stableford and produced in Bristol by Andrew Dawes of the BBC Natural History Unit. You can find out more about the programme on the Radio 4 website.